All right, so welcome back to APUSH. Today we're going to cover the Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. We are going to get as far as we can into get as far as we can up to 1900, covering transitions, how the country changed after the Civil War, and then really the making of industrial America as we recognize it. A lot of the major, pretty much almost all of the major course themes, except maybe America and the World, we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about migration and settlement with Western movement, with new immigration patterns, new immigration restrictions, urbanization. That also applies to geography and the environment, cities growing up, cities growing out. We're going to talk about politics and protest, not so much the federal government, which in this period was about as weak as it ever was. Very intentionally so. But we're going to talk a bit about protest movements such as populism and the labor movement. And we're going to talk about how politicians in both parties work to make the work of big business easier than ever. We'll talk about American national identity with the peak of manifest destiny, with the transcontinental railroad knitting the country together, not just the economy, but moving people and moving goods around to an unprecedented degree and faster than ever. And we're going to talk about social structure, about the backlash against immigrants, against Native Americans, the rise of Jim Crow, race relations deteriorating in any number of ways. But first and foremost, we're going to talk about the core of the Gilded Age, work, technology, and economics, the industrialization of America as we know it, the birth of the American middle class and the working class as we know them, and the transformation of everyday life made possible by all sorts of new inventions and new forms of economic organization. I'll spend a couple minutes just talking about Reconstruction. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking about Reconstruction, putting the country together back after the Civil War. And this is not just an ending to the Civil War, not just an ending to the debate about slavery, but it is a beginning of modern America, refashioning of a new United States after the bloody conflict. And in the wake of the Civil War, the federal government begins to try to reconstruct the South. Reconstruction passed through various phases, but in its most radical form, Reconstruction's architects envisioned a social revolution in the South that would give political and civil rights to the former slaves. Among the most important legacies of Reconstruction are the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which you can pretty much assume could come up on the AP exam and will certainly come up on the subject test. These amendments give equal protection, due process to male citizens of the United States and guarantee voting rights. It takes more than a century for these rights to be more or less guaranteed, but nonetheless, the work in many ways begins here. In Reconstruction, you have Republican congressmen seeking to reconstruct the South by making it possible for African Americans to become full property owners and full citizens, including voting rights. You have 3 million slaves, former slaves, looking for autonomy over their families, their work, and their churches. But they lack the money, the credit, the land to establish themselves as independent, self-sustaining farmers. You have President Andrew Johnson, who until 1864 had been a Democrat and ran as Lincoln's Vice President on a unity ticket, bent on keeping the pre-war order that kept Black field laborers dependent on white landowners. And you had Southern elites, white Southern elites, who, perhaps not surprisingly, were resentful of the freed slaves and the $2 billion in lost human property that they were now deprived of, and that they were not prepared to cede or to see former slaves as full citizens. Now, during the war, Abraham Lincoln had proposed a relatively forgiving plan for a quick reunification of the country called the 10% Plan. He outlined this in 1863, and it basically allowed Confederate states to form new state governments once 10% of the men who had voted in 1860 pledged allegiance to the Union and to ending slavery. This never happened. Lincoln was, of course, killed before he ever had the chance to help put the country back together. Andrew Johnson instead wanted to see the planter elite humiliated, but he did not want to really change the overall social order. Radical Republicans who never trusted Johnson argued with Johnson all the time and wanted to go much further in punishing the rebels and rebuilding the South. They wanted to use the full force of the federal government to advance African-American political freedoms and economic independence. And finally, you had African-Americans freed from slavery, invoking the freedoms that they believed rightfully were theirs. And they were determined to become full players in economically independent in the post-war South. As I noted, Reconstruction goes through a few phases. You have the 13th Amendment as part of the presidential Reconstruction, sort of led by Andrew Johnson, that banned slavery throughout the United States, passed by and ratified by the end of 1865. But you also have the reassertion of Southern white political power in the form of the Black Codes, which attempt to restore as much of the old racial order as possible. Southern white resistance also took extra legal forms, including campaigns of violence and intimidation against freed people. In 1866, former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest founded a social club of Tennessee war veterans, the Ku Klux Klan, which instigated some of the campaigns of violence. By 1867, we move into congressional Reconstruction. And because of the Black Codes outrage, they outrage the radical Republicans. That leads to the passage of the 14th Amendment over Andrew Johnson's opposition. And APUSH really loves the 14th Amendment because it's arguably the most important amendment since the Bill of Rights. There's many components, but the ones that are most relevant, not only for the exam, but for society from 1867 to 1866 to the present, are the ones that guarantee equal protection under the law and due process for all individuals, becoming the basis for civil rights and civil liberties legislation as we know it. I won't go into all the details about Reconstruction, but basically the South is divided up, as you see the map, into military districts where federal troops keep order throughout the region and protect federal government agents, protect Northern teachers who have come down to educate African Americans. And you have a new plan that guarantees that states will not be readmitted into the Union until they ratify the 14th Amendment. I won't go into the whole impeachment battle over Andrew Johnson. He is the first president impeached. That seems like a very unlikely topic to come up on this exam. In 1870, but you should know what happened. In 1870, the 15th Amendment is ratified, which prohibits denying men the right to vote based on their race. Though, as we see, for the better part of the next century and beyond, opponents of African American suffrage find other ways to disenfranchise freedmen. And as this is happening, you have the formal disenfranchisement that I'll talk about a little more, but you also have the campaigns of violence and intimidation conducted by the growing Ku Klux Klan that targets freed African Americans as well as white Republican school teachers, preachers, and even white voters who might not be in favor of the Democratic Party. And so very quickly, we begin to see the gains made by African Americans eroding shortly after the Civil War. By the early 1870s, the North's commitment to Reconstruction was beginning to wane, particularly made worse by the Panic of 1873, an economic depression that strikes the country. And by 1877, the federal government withdraws its troops from the South. With that, Reconstruction collapses. And in its place, basically, issues of racial equality are put on the back burner for the next century. By the end of the 19th century, most Southern states had effectively disenfranchised African Americans. The Supreme Court rules in Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation was legal, and the rates of lynching are astronomical. Literally thousands of African Americans are killed year after year across the South, sometimes beyond, but especially in the South. Come back to that in a moment. You have the era of the Redeemers, the so-called Redeemers, the white Democratic political leaders who sort of represent the return of the white Southern political elite, the planter elite in particular, to political power. Even though you have the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in place, you also have new measures to keep Blacks from voting. You have poll taxes, you have literary taxes, you have something called the grandfather clause that prohibits you from voting if your grandfather didn't have the right to vote back at a certain point, and so on. You have, in what's effectively a one-party state, the Democratic Party ruling the South, African Americans banned from voting in political parties' primaries, another form of disenfranchisement. As all of this is going on, you do have a new generation of Southern leaders, business leaders, political leaders, beginning to envision a different day. Not one we would call equality, but one that sort of saw the South as industrially lagging behind the rest of the country, but saw that as the reason that the South lost the Civil War, that it couldn't compete economically with the North, and called for rapid industrialization of the South. And we'll see later in the slideshow the maps of railroads, but you'll see how the South finally is tied into the rest of the country by railroads. You have new industries such as steel industries in Birmingham, Alabama. You have the rise of a tobacco industry in North Carolina, particularly around Durham and the Duke family's American Tobacco Company, which begins really the process of industrializing tobacco production, and with cigarette rolling machines, making extraordinary amounts of money there. So we have, and as I said, we have the rise of what's called Jim Crow, where you have a whole system of banning, segregating public accommodations, work, laws against interracial marriage, whole system of effectively what amounts to American apartheid, separating the races physically, culturally, legally. African Americans are not just sort of sitting by quietly during all of this. There are various advocates who are noted for their leadership in African American communities, and the two that are most likely to come up on APUSH and on the subject test are Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington represents what some consider an accommodationist viewpoint, with a focus on vocational education, on manual labor, on economic advancement, not political equality, taking the argument that as African Americans improve their position economically, political equality would follow once they'd proven their worth. Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute as a leading, what we now call historically Black college, but aimed at providing such kind of vocational education to African Americans. And from the start, this viewpoint was challenged by W.E.B. Du Bois and by other Black leaders, really from a Black vanguard, that worried about the entire African American population, but argued for what was often termed in the day uplift, that the Black elite would lead the broader African American community to better economic times and to political equality. And W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or what we call the NAACP, still to this day. And he was the first African American in the country to receive a PhD from Harvard. So, and some African Americans began to sort of move to the cities, to northern cities, but even to southern cities like North Carolina, to southern cities like Raleigh or to Atlanta from rural places. And they also began to move west. And this represented, a part of the broader movement of Americans to the Western territories. So I'm going to shift west for the moment. And I'm going to use two maps to sort of get at the idea of how Americans thought about the West, and substantially white Americans. This map from much earlier, from 1718, made by a French cartographer, shows a very detailed map of the country. And it's a little hard to see here, but you have through everywhere on this map the names of individual native peoples, very much giving the impression that this was, in fact, a fully inhabited continent filled with the original peoples of North America. In turn, you have maps such as this one, a well-known map from its time by Emma Willard, that present the United States beyond the Appalachians as basically empty, waiting to be filled, waiting to be settled. People see, map making is is very much a product of what people imagine the world to be, how they see what they want to see. And this land is clearly not empty, not of Native Americans, not of the Spanish, not of Mexican Americans, especially after the Mexican-American War, and not of original French and Spanish colonists. You've probably heard in your classes about Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis. Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian at the University of Wisconsin who gave a lecture in 1893 about the frontier's role in American history. And he had an idea that there had been this perpetual frontier marching westwards from the East Coast, where the frontier served as a safety valve for the social conflicts that might otherwise tear the East apart. People could just go west to this imagined open land. And he wrote this, he gave this speech in 1893 after the census had measured in 1890 that the census, basically there was no longer a measurable frontier. As it turns out, for the last century, statisticians, historians, and other scholars have been arguing it was a lot more complicated than that. And of course, these regions had many more people there than Turner imagined, or many other advocates of manifest destiny imagined. We talked a little bit last time about the gold rush and about some early Western settlement, but this really accelerates after the Civil War. Once the Civil War is over, you no longer have arguments about admitting new territories as slave states or free states. You no longer have arguments about where to build railroads. And so the building of the railroads means you very quickly it becomes much easier to settle the territories, and you have a whole bunch of new Western territories, now the better part of the Western states of the country, organized in the 1860s through the 1880s. We tend to think about the frontier as just coming from the East, but there's also people marching and moving eastwards from California and north from Texas and Mexico. And you even have frontiers sort of building outwards from the mining towns that build wherever you find gold, wherever you find silver, wherever you find copper. So the frontier, there are in fact many frontiers. I'm not going to go into much detail about the economies of mining and ranching, but they are absolutely essential to understanding the growth of the West. Knowing that in the case of mining, this is first in California and Nevada, but also in South Dakota, elsewhere, as well as new mineral deposits are found. The population is virtually all male in these mining communities, drawing substantial immigrants, not only from Europe, but from Asia and Mexico. And we have these images of, the 49er, the individual gold prospector, but very quickly, mining becomes a large-scale industrial enterprise because large-scale economic industrial enterprises are the only ones that have the capital for the massive machinery, and to mine further below and for less glamorous but profitable minerals such as copper, such as lead, such as quartz. The industry grows quickly, and because the conditions that miners are working are so brutal, the mining communities of the West become the site of some of the most radical labor organizing in American history. Ranching and farming likewise become huge industries, and they follow a similar pattern where the workforces were very diverse, much more than our stereotypical images of the cowboy on the horse, who is usually imagined to be a white cowboy. There are, in fact, about a third of the cowboys are Mexican American or African American. Very quickly, the ranching and farming become the business of very large-scale enterprises, as individual farmers, individual ranches can't begin to compete, especially as you need access to railroads. Now, a few groups suffer from this, from the developments. I'm going to focus on and the environment, for that matter, suffers from this rapid growth of mining, ranching, and farming. But the two groups I'll mention are Native Americans and Chinese immigrants. We talked before about China, last time, about Indian removal, especially to Oklahoma, and the idea that was going to be a permanent frontier. It's not the case, as you might imagine. Once the gold rush happens, once the railroads crisscross the Western United States, that becomes absolutely clear, and you have a new policy of concentrating Native Americans on reservations, pushing them into smaller and smaller bits of land. You have diseases like smallpox, like measles, continuing to decimate native populations. You have railroads that decimate buffalo populations, and hunting that basically destroys the main source of food for many of the native peoples, as well as supply of housing materials. As Native Americans grow more desperate in these economically tough times, they launch attacks on settlers, leading to the quote-unquote Indian Wars of the 1870s through 1890, which come to an end after the Battle of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. That marks an end to military and armed resistance by Native peoples, though organized protest movements continue to this day, as you may have heard about, for example, the recent pipeline protests in North Dakota. You do have something that comes up on the exams pretty regularly, the Dawes Act, which is part of the broader federal shift to assimilation. The Dawes Act allows for native lands that had been traditionally owned communally to be broken up into individually owned parcels of land, to individual allotments that can then be individually bought and sold. And much of the land that Native Americans have gets sold off quickly as people are desperate for whatever cash they can have. And so Native Americans lose more and more land. I will also mention Chinese immigrants. First, Chinese immigrants come from Asia, from China, as gold prospectors, and then as workers to build the new railroads in the West. As the railroads are built, you have the merchants of Chinatowns across the West, but also Chinese workers going into agricultural labor, into food service, into sort of small enterprises like laundry shops, and making living like immigrants from other regions do in other parts of the United States. When there's the economic downturn in the 1870s and 1880s, it's quickly blamed on Chinese immigrants and sort of about what their purported threat to American values. And so you have lynchings of Chinese immigrants, you have other mob violence in the Western United States, and this leads to popular pressure to pass a ban on Chinese immigration. And in fact, in 1882, the federal government does indeed ban immigration almost completely from China with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is the beginning of a series of race and ethnicity-based immigration restrictions that we'll see over the next half century. All right, let me pause there for just a second, but we're going to turn now to the Gilded Age. And I know we're covering a lot of ground today, but with the rest of the class time, we'll talk about the Gilded Age, about industrialization, urbanization, a little more about immigration, and then the protest movements of the labor and populist movements. You may have heard the term the Gilded Age, its origins. In 1873, Mark Twain published his first novel called The Gilded Age. And what Twain did in The Gilded Age was to satirize the trend towards corruption in public affairs and the wild financial speculation that produced both great poverty and great wealth, the growth of large businesses that received economic and political support from government officials served to enrich investors, politicians, and at the expense of workers and farmers. With his novel, Twain gave this period its name. It speaks to if you know what gilded is, it's about basically gold paint, something that is bright, shiny, beautiful, sort of symbolizing wealth, but it's also, a millimeter or 2 millimeters thick, and, basic wood can be underneath it, basic concrete. You don't have to scratch far below gilded paint to find something much uglier. And that's what Twain was getting at with the Gilded Age. And it speaks to the extravagance, the extreme wealth, and the extreme wealth gap of this period. And the Gilded Age has come to be understood as a period of the rise of big business, of industrial capitalism, virtually entirely unfettered, unregulated by the federal government or other forces in society. As I said at the beginning of today's discussion, this is basically the lowest point in the power of the federal government, with some of the least memorable presidents of this period. There's a reason we don't think much about Rutherford B. Hayes, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, James Garfield. They're probably not going to come up on the subject test. I can't imagine they're going to come up on the AP exam. And they're intentionally weak presidents. They're presidents who believe that their job mostly Republicans, one Democrat, Cleveland, in there, is to support big business and to do as little as possible to get in the way. It's, critical to understanding this period, and then for that matter, the progressive era we'll talk about next week that comes up in response to this period, that the national political system is not responsive to social changes and to the tremendous changes of this era. And people look elsewhere for help. In the cities, they look to urban political machines. In the plains, they look to state legislatures. I'm not going to get into much of the party politics of this period. The Democrats and the Republicans struggle to form working majorities. They agree on almost all issues. They disagree on tariffs, a few other issues. Tariffs really is the biggest point of their disagreement, but overall, they fundamentally agree on their job being to get out of the way of big business. And this is the era when industrialization really picks up steam. We talked last week about the origins of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. This is where it hits full force acceleration. In 1860, for example, the United States was the fourth largest industrial producer in the world. By 1890, it is the #1 industrial producer in the world. Last time, I talked about the market revolutions. I talked about the huge advances in communications and transportation, the early railroads, the canals, the steamship, the telegraphs, and more, that all link the United States into a global market. These developments just keep coming during the 1860s through 1900. You have, for example, the laying of the first transatlantic cable in 1860. You have the invention of the telephone in 1876. You have some of the first office machinery, the typewriter, for example. You have something called the Bessemer process, which is, I won't get into the technical details, but basically it's a process imported from Scotland that makes it really easy and really cheap to build super strong steel. And this Andrew Carnegie finds out about this, brings it to the United States, and builds his steel empire. And this steel is far lighter and far stronger, far more durable than iron. And this allows for the building of bridges and skyscrapers. Come back to that with urbanization. We have new technologies with petroleum, with oil, the ability to distill petroleum into kerosene and into lubricants. You have new drilling techniques. And eventually you have the first combustion engine. And that brings us very soon, with the new oil, with the new steel, to the birth of the automobile age and the automobile society. We'll get into that more next time, but this is where it begins. You have the beginning of industrial research and corporate research as we would recognize it, the first research labs. And the most famous by far was Thomas Edison and his quote-unquote invention factory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Edison is credited with more than 1,000 patents for inventions all across the economy. Most famously, remember his light bulb and his phonograph, but he helped invent or directly invented all sorts of new industrial communications technologies and helped harnessing electricity so that there's a light in factories, machinery in factories is running. You eventually have streets lit up by electric lamps and homes as well. You have a new class of millionaires, even billionaires, who provide capital to this. You have the age of the robber barons. A few that might come up, John D. Rockefeller comes up regularly for his role with Standard Oil. You have, again, Andrew Carnegie with the steel industry. You have railroad magnates, Cornelius Vanderbilt and Leland Stanford. You have J.P. Morgan, who helps basically buys Carnegie's steel empire and builds that even further. And you have virtually no regulation of the industries here. You have a Supreme Court decision, Wabash versus Illinois, that says only the federal governments, not states, can regulate interstate commerce. You have the next year an Interstate Commerce Commission set up, in principle allowing the federal government to regulate commerce, but it does very little. You have in 1890 the Sherman Antitrust Act, which outlaws trusts and monopolies and other forms of economic organization that fix prices in order to limit trade. But the law itself is pretty vague. It's partially invalidated by the Supreme Court. Mostly it's significant as being a precursor to the much stronger reforms of the Progressive era. And it's used in 1895 to break labor strikes, arguing that collective labor action is a restraint of trade. And I want to go back to this slide about railroads. I mean, it gives a sense of how the country is knit together. Again, you see now the South fully knit in. You have railways across the entire country. And the railroads are the prime example of the first mega corporation. Railroads are absolutely essential for transportation, of course, but they really stimulate the entire economy. When railroads thrive, the rest of the country thrived. When the railroads stumbled, the rest of the country stumbles. You have, again, this dramatic increase in railroad mileage over the 1870s through the 1890s. You have, and I alluded to this last time, the carving up of the country into time zones to standardize time for the benefit of the trains. And this is something that comes not from the government, but from the train owners, the train companies, and the population accepts this. Eventually, the federal government, years and years later, makes it official. But it is the railroads that divide the country into our 4 time zones. The growth of the railroad industry fuels the further growth of the steel industry, as you can imagine. I'll give you a sense of the scale of what's going on here. In 1850, textile companies were the largest companies in the country, and they would have maybe 800 employees. By 1880, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company has 50,000 or so workers, a massive expansion of economic enterprise. And what this does is that you have a need, and this dynamic's replicated all over the place. And what you basically have is a need for organization, a need for managerial elites. And what that managerial elite becomes is the new middle class. Again, I talked last week that before industrialization, there had always been this little thin stratum of the middle class, of teachers, of merchants, of lawyers, of doctors. But this is where you have a mass middle class growing, because you have economic enterprises big enough that you need managers, you need administration. You've probably also heard about the ideological justification for the federal government doing nothing, and frankly, for things being the way they were, social Darwinism. You have this whole school started by a British philosopher, adapted into, by American advocates who take what Charles Darwin had to say about evolutionary biology and apply it to the social arena, to the political and economic arenas, that there's a social survival of the fittest. And the fittest are rewarded with money, with power. And the quote unquote losers deserve their fate, but they're deemed lazy, weak, morally depraved, or biologically inferior. And this is beyond the scope of our lecture, but there's a whole rise of applying Darwin's ideas to new racial taxonomies, sexual taxonomies, to categorize people based on their race, their sexuality, that had been inconceivable beforehand. But it is part of the haves and the have-nots, who belongs, who thrives, who does not. And business leaders, not surprisingly, love social Darwinism as it justifies what they do. You can read in, probably if you have a textbook, you'd read about Andrew Carnegie, who believed in social Darwinism, but also did promote a gospel of wealth, arguing that the rich did have some responsibility to care for the less fortunate. And Carnegie gave away tons of money to build libraries, schools, and other institutions that would help those who had less access to resources. So I want to talk about how the country becomes an urban country. This is a remarkable shift. Before 1860, the United States had very few true cities. Chicago, established in 1820 as a trading post, was still a small town in 1850. We talked a bit about that last time. San Francisco, just a couple thousand people before the gold rush. Even New York at the start of the Civil War was only a few stories tall. Chicago, by 1860, let's take Chicago as an example. By 1860, Chicago has 100,000 people. By 1890, it has 1 million people, 10 times more people. And just think for a moment about what you need in the way of an infrastructure to support 10 times the population. I mean, imagine the greater DC area now growing 10 times over, and what the strain on our infrastructure would be. It's virtually unimaginable. Chicago, we've talked about this as a place where livestock from the West is shipped east. It's a meeting of rural and urban, a place where East and West meet, and with links to the South, as the South is further reintegrated economically into the whole country. During the half century or so after the Civil War, the population of the United States quadruples, grows 4 times over. That's pretty dramatic as it is. But in that same period from 1865 to 1915, the urban population of the United States grows 7 times. This pattern is repeated around the world. Between 1820 and 1920, some 60 million people around the world moved from rural areas to urban areas. I alluded to the reasons for this last time. They happen in the United States, they happen in Europe, they happen in China. You have a push factor and a pull factor, with the push factor being the invention of new industrial agricultural machinery that reduces dramatically the amount of labor you need in rural areas. And you have the pull of new jobs in urban factories with the growth of the factory system. And despite how dangerous those jobs were, how limited the pay could be, those were often better opportunities than you could find in rural regions. So during this period, cities are growing up and they're growing outwards. And this particular image of the Brooklyn Bridge captures a bit of both. Before 1860, the limitations of masonry meant that buildings could only go about 4 stories, 5 stories high. Even as late as 1880, and you can kind of see this here to some degree, church steeples are still dominating many cities' skylines. Once you get steel, you get skyscrapers. You could build buildings that are now 10, 20, even 30 stories tall. With the new technologies, you also you had new heating systems, invention of new systems to circulate water and heat through a 10, 20, 30 story building. You had Elisha Graves Otis inventing the first reliable elevator, which is why his name still appears in virtually every elevator you go into. And so by the 1880s, by 1890s, you have elevators taking people up these new skyscrapers. You also have growth outwards. In the colonial period, Benjamin Franklin could walk from one end of Boston to another in just an hour. Cities grow between the 1780s and 1880s, but really cities pick up speed in their growth in this period. It's made possible by a number of developments, but particularly the rise of streetcars and by bridges. You have the first electric streetcars made possible by power lines, as well as the invention of steel for the cars. And you even then could have the first subways. Without a steam engine, you don't have to worry about smoke-filled tunnels. And so you can have tunnels built under the East River, pictured here. You can have tunnels under the Charles River in Boston. Boston opens the first subway system in the country in 1897. New York follows suit in 1904 with its system that to this day remains the largest subway system in the country. You have the beginning with streetcars of early suburbanization. For the first time, you don't have to live close to where you work. You can take a streetcar to your job and back. However, by and large, that's a luxury for the middle class and the upper class. And as middle and upper classes move out to suburbs, the city cores are filled with poorer Americans, especially immigrants. They take over the factories, they take over the brownstones, they live in shanties and cellars. And city centers, like in New York, turn into slums. You may have come across Jacob Riis, one of the first documentary photographers who, with How the Other Half Lives, documented Riis documented the plight of immigrants in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He himself was a Danish immigrant. In many ways, the attention he brought to conditions of facing the poor in New York City and elsewhere paved the way for a series of other investigative writers and photographers, and more generally reformers during the Progressive era. We'll come back to them next time. In bridges, again, having something like the Brooklyn Bridge, helps unify New York City from 5 separate cities into a united city in 1898, made up of its 5 boroughs. Now, who comes to these cities, whether it's New York, whether it's Chicago, whether it's Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore? Chicago or St. Louis. Sometimes it's African Americans fleeing the South, and especially fleeing the rural South, facing the violence of extrajudicial forces like the Ku Klux Klan and lynch mobs. Economic opportunities are limited, but they're still often better than sharecropping. Even if factories sometimes ban African Americans from working there, African Americans can find jobs as domestic servants, as cooks, as janitors, and the opportunities as socially, economically low on the totem pole as they may have been, still represented a step up from sharecropping in physical safety and in status. You have young women coming from rural America. As new machinery reduced the need for farm labor, you have many young people, and especially young women, going to the city to seek new opportunities. And Theodore Dreiser's novel Sister Carrie is all about this, comes up on the subject test, as the young farm girl from Wisconsin who goes to Chicago to seek her fortune. But overwhelmingly, and you already know this, the key source of urban growth during this period was immigration. In the period from 1865 to 1896, 11 million immigrants come to the United States, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. During the period, the next 25 years or so, between 1896 and 1920, another 20 million immigrants come to the country. So by 1910, 15% of the country are immigrants coming directly to the United States. Another 20% of the country are the children of immigrants. So literally more than a third of the country are either themselves immigrants or the children of immigrants. And these numbers are much, much higher in cities like New York, like Chicago, like Detroit. Immigration isn't new, but it's accelerated by the dynamics I've talked about. Immigration also is coming from Latin America. It's coming at least from Asia to a lesser degree after the Chinese Exclusion Act, but nonetheless, the same push-pull forces are going on there too. Not everyone stays. Many immigrants go home after making the money they came to. And we often think about immigration as a battle between assimilation or holding on to your culture. The reality is both things are happening. Many people find ways to become American, to assimilate, at the same time that they hold on to what makes them Italian, Greek, Chinese, Jewish, Russian, etc. You do have all sorts of problems in the cities. Your textbook will go into some of the details, but fires are scourged. Not only the famous Chicago fire, but San Francisco, Boston, Baltimore all suffer major fires. There are cholera epidemics in any number of places, notably in Memphis. You have real problems with sanitation. You have real problems with other disease, with crime. And this is something that eventually progressive era reformers tackle. But first, you have urban political machines tackling them as well. The urban machines, the most famous of which is the New York City one, led by Boss Tweed and his Tammany Hall. These are machines that on one hand centralize services, centralize police and fire services, sanitation services, public welfare services. But they're also beset by fraud, by extortion, by vote buying, and a general lack of accountability. So they are to some a godsend, and they are others a complete scourge and the representation of everything wrong, quote unquote, with a changing country. All right, I've covered a lot of ground, and I know everybody's time is limited. I've got one more section, but I'm going to go through this and just keep it recording. If anyone needs to leave, they're welcome to do so, and the rest will be on YouTube. But I will finish up with labor and populism. We do here have the birth of the industrial labor, basically the American working class as we recognize it, and the birth of the American labor movement. In this period, roughly 70–75% of the American workforce belongs to the working class. This includes ever larger numbers of women working as domestic servants in department stores, in family businesses, and in any number of other places. You also have a rather large child labor labor force. 10% of girls, 20% of boys between the ages of 10 and 15 are working. By 1900, 1.7 million children under the age of 16 are employed. Remember what we talked about last time with the market revolution and leaving behind the household economy. The household economy was, you basically made what you needed to survive: food, clothing, soap, other household goods. If you made extra that you could sell, fantastic. But really, this was about selling what you could. Now you have really the growth of wage labor. Talked about a little bit last time, accelerates dramatically here. For some, going into wage labor opportunities is an opportunity. For others, it's a response to hardship. And these factories tend to be dangerous places. There are tens of thousands of accidents every year. In fact, between 1880 and 1900, 35,000 workers are killed on average each year. More than 500,000 are injured on average each year. There are mining cave-ins. There are train wrecks. There are explosions in industrial plants, fires in textile mills, workers maimed by machinery. These are extraordinarily dangerous places to work. And there's no protection. There's no occupational there is no occupational health and safety legislation. There's no unemployment benefits. There's no workers' compensation. And courts consistently backed employers, not workers, if workers tried to get any kind of compensation. In the interest of time, I won't go into the details of skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled workers, but basically they are what they sound like. Skilled workers tend to be primarily tend to be primarily white male workers, primarily of historic populations, say from Northern Europe. They tend to be working in industries where you make something like an entire piece, say glass blowing, some early steel jobs as well. And skilled workers had relatively more power than, as you might imagine, than semi-skilled or unskilled workers. They could control wages sometimes, they could sometimes control production goals and so on. They had power because they knew how to make things. But as this period progresses, you have more and more jobs turning into, that are mechanized and that are made simpler in ways that made it easier to trade in and out workers, making workers' much more replaceable. Semi-skilled workers, would be in something like making a light bulb. Long before Henry Ford invents the assembly line or develops the assembly line for cars, Thomas Edison's light bulb had 35 steps, 35 quote unquote operations in the language of the day. And each person did one of those tasks and could be easily replaced as needed. And so semi-skilled workers had limited power in the workplace. And unsurprisingly, unskilled workers had the least power. They were moving from job to job, finding whatever you could. They were paid by the day. Unemployment was pretty much a perpetual force of life. These are often workers working in the most dangerous situations. But from fully skilled workers to unskilled workers, there's the question about how workers are finding themselves in low-paid, thankless, and insecure jobs. And in the United States, and for that matter around the industrial world, this is really the birth of the labor movement as we recognize it. And this is, along with the populist, represents one of the two grassroots movements to change things from the bottom up, from the grassroots up. We'll talk next time about the progressive movement and how has some grassroots elements, but is more top down. But the labor movement is organizing in the US and Canada, in Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, and so on, in Japan as well. There are massive labor strikes in this period. From 1880 to 1905, there's nearly 37,000 strikes involving 7 million American workers. Your textbook, if you have a textbook, or your crash course guide, will have a guide to some of the big ones. The Great Railroad Strike in 1877, a mining strike in Idaho in 1892, the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania in 1892 as well, the Pullman Strike in Illinois in 1894. These are some of the biggest strikes that textbooks cover, that shape the course of American workers and the labor movement. And you have sort of common themes of federal troops being called in to break up the strikes, or sometimes private agencies like the Pinkerton Agency with professional strikebreakers. You have, as I alluded to, this use of the Supreme Court to say that labor action is illegal as a restraint on trade, allegedly. You have a couple major labor organizations like the Knights of Labor, the National Labor Union, and the American Federation of Labor. Just briefly, the Knights of Labor tended to represent both skilled and unskilled laborers. Knights of Labor had some interracial membership. Some units were segregated, but some Black workers were welcomed in. Some women were welcomed in as organizers as well, or as constituents. The American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, focuses only on skilled labor and pretty much only on white male labor. They had more leverage because of the relative power of skilled labor, but nonetheless had to deal with the changing economy and the continual threats to skilled labor. Gompers and other AFL leaders do believe that women belonged in the domestic sphere, not in the workplace, and so did not advocate for women workers. And I'm going to finish up with the populist movement. Very quickly, this is a grassroots movement, as I alluded to a moment ago. It's a rural movement that, in contrast to the labor movement, which is in the larger cities, in the mid-sized cities, and in other places like the western mining towns, where you have heavy industrial operations. The populist movement is a response to a number of forces. Basically, farmers across the Midwest and in the South go into tremendous debt from a combination of the way contracts work, railroads squeezing out small independent farmers, some of the worst droughts in American history. And this leads to a movement that calls for government regulation of the railroads, calls for any number of other reform, including direct election of senators, for free silver, basically the idea that you would have a fixed exchange rate between silver and gold to back up the dollar. And this would cause inflation that would then make it easier for farmers to get out of debt. They call for lower tariffs, they call for women's voting rights, they call for a federal income tax. Most, not all, of their demands actually come to pass during the Progressive era. Not free silver, but direct election of senators. Pretty much everything else I rattled off comes to be during the Progressive era. The progressive movement becomes a major third power party, probably the most significant third party in the post-Civil War period. There are debates about whether to work within the Democratic Party or to sort of stay on its own. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan runs on both the populist and Democratic platforms, loses to William McKinley, and that campaign really marks the end of the populist movement as a major force in the country. But to finish off today, I'm going to talk about a populist parable, one that American studies scholars decades ago pointed out. Some question this, but I think it's a useful way to sort of get at the issues that the populist movement represented and advocated for. And that is the story of the Wizard of Oz. L. Frank Baum writes The Wizard of Oz in the late 1800s, apparently as a populist parable. He is telling the story of a bright, of basically what happens in Kansas, representing the drought-stricken, impoverished regions of the Midwest during the 1870s and 1880s. There is this fierce, undefeatable young woman who can't be stopped despite everything that's thrown at her, representing the farm women of the Midwest. In the case of the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy. A terrible storm whisks her away to a magical place, the land of Oz. She makes friends. She meets the farmer with all the wisdom he needs. With the farmer, the earnest, the loyal farmer, the Scarecrow, and the hardworking industrial worker, the Tin Man. She follows in the original books, in the movie, most of you have probably seen the movie, there's the ruby slippers. In the books, they're silver slippers. Dorothy and her friends go down the yellow brick road to the Emerald City. And I should note, what is the abbreviation for ounce? So the populists called for a fixed exchange rate, 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold to be the permanent exchange rate underlying the American dollar. What's the abbreviation for ounces? OZ. Dorothy and her friends reach the Emerald City, where they are met by the wizard, who turns out to be a complete charlatan. He can be a stand-in for pretty much any Gilded Age president. He has no real power. He doesn't do anything to help her. He's just a charlatan. Eventually, with the help of her friends, Dorothy figures out that she had the power within her, with her slippers, to go home. She had all the power, all the wisdom she needed, and she does return home. And there you have, there's more to the parable, but for the interest of time, that'll give you the idea to sort of think about how the populist movement, was so fixated on this issue of free silver, and more broadly on the sort of addressing the way that industrialization had left the American farmer behind. I'm going to pause there because we're going to switch next time to the progressive era and how that all starts again with the address how progressive reformers address the ills of industrial society in the big cities. So we'll pause there and we'll pick this up next week. Have a good one, and don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions. Take care now. Bye.